Morning, everyone. Hi, my name is Yichen Qin. I'm the Associate Professor of Business Analytics at UC. I'm the chair for today's breakout session. Welcome. So today we are very pleased to have Nick Wu from AlignAI to give us this wonderful talk about measuring the value of AI solutions. So a little bit background about Nick. Nick is currently the Senior Director of Growth and Customer Success at AlignAI. And his professional data work spans aerospace, automotive, insurance, consumer packaged goods, and nonprofit. Earning Lean Six Sigma Black Belt certification during his time at Ohio State, Nick started his career in system engineering, physics, organizational psychology, working in organizations like Boeing and Honda in setting up early data science function before shifting into product and transformation leadership roles. He provides data workshops for data science, engineering, management, analytics teams to help advance their AI capacity and volunteers with Franklin County Children's Services. So let's welcome Nick.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for coming. It is quite the honor to speak here at the Data Science Symposium. I've attended this for multiple years now, but to actually speak here is such a pleasure. So, as he said, my name is Nick. My background's in engineering, statistics, operations research, and organizational psychology. I come from a company called AlignAI. Really, companies around here use AlignAI to really bring in their AI strategy into operations. So we're called AlignAI because we align the C-suite down to the analytics level around how do we actually see value from AI use cases and how we actually implement AI use cases into our day-to-day operations. So today's talk is going to be all about how we've seen teams implement use cases. And I've worked with over 50 teams now in terms of implementing use cases for AI, as well as trying to measure value. So what I've done is, well, from my experience as well as research that I could find, to basically boil down to like what are tactics that teams are actually using to try and point to value at the individual level and then ultimately up to the organizational level. And then my hope today is that you not only contribute to the conversation, but take some of these tactics back to your own work. So please, let's make it a conversation, ask questions. I understand we're coming a little late from the first session, so I get a little extra time at the end too, to go a little long as well. So any questions before I go ahead and get started? I'll get into it. Okay, awesome. So I'm going to talk about really tactics that a lot of organizations are applying, but really, as you guys all know, every single organization is unique in its people, processes, and technology. So there's some common threads in how teams at large enterprises and small businesses are going to think about impact, but of course respect that each org has their own setup in terms of like who is where, what are the processes that they follow, and then what technology are they using too. To break down today in our high-level topics, we're going to break down starting with AI adoption. So how do individuals derive value through increased autonomy? Working with AI often affords more autonomy rather than less, so we'll get into that. How does AI adherence, aka the more people that use AI, drive more value in an organization? And how can we start to set up a virtuous cycle of use and value inside of our own teams? And then lastly, bringing the adoption and the adherence back to the organizational AI value. So what does that relationship look like in our orgs today between the individual value and the organizational value, and really ensuring that it's additive and not zero-sum in that way. Cool. So let's start with the first topic, AI adoption. So obviously there's a personal value that we should get in terms of deriving value through greater competence. And more often it's competence in job performance. So how can individuals use inputs from AI to ultimately make better decisions and drive better decisions in their own workflows in that way? So the first personal value that a lot of individuals get from AI use cases is through augmented decision making. Pretty straightforward, this should be pretty obvious to us. But essentially, how can we drive better augmented decision making in something like insurance claims? So claims adjusters essentially trying to identify fraudulent claims with the thousands of data points that they have on a claimant or in a manufacturing organization. How are we best predicting manufacturing downtime? When should we actually go out to the floor and take a machine down for preventative maintenance and using that to augment the decisions there too? That's where I really love the industry term co-pilot that's coming about in terms of thinking about AI not as the one-all be-all, one solution and answer that we get, but ultimately a co-pilot in our own work. And the theory behind that is if the co-pilot goes down when flying an airplane, you as a human still have control over flying the plane and ultimately getting it to the end destination, with or without AI in that place. So expanding on personal value, we have found that providing insights for the individual to make better decisions and really learning how to become more competent in their job, we find that in our own research, along with other research, people are about 1.8 times more likely to see value and derive value from AI when they're getting personal, valuable suggestions in their own work in that way. So in addition to that, individuals who work in organizations who are focusing on improving the quality of decisions, such as operations scheduling or inventory management, are 1.5 as likely to perceive individual value from AI as those who do not. So we're starting to talk about that relationship between personal value in your workflow with AI, with the organizational value and the focus that the organization has communicated about value for AI. Individuals derive value through increased autonomy. So working with AI often affords individuals more autonomy rather than less. So let's break down that in a few ways. So from an individual autonomy standpoint, really AI can support from a learning standpoint around helping people learn from past actions by projecting the outcomes of current actions, by providing timely information about relevant past situations, and by offering feedback on consequences of past actions in order to suggest ways to improve performance. All ways that the person in their work can feel more and more autonomous through support of AI in these ways. And one thing that I really want to emphasize here is that the goal is not to dictate exactly what associates need to think and do. I put this up as a real quote because somebody said this to me. Like, we want to implement an AI solution so we can tell associates exactly what they need to think and do, which is absolutely wrong in my perspective. I think it should be a balance of improving the ways that they get information so they can ultimately feel more autonomous in the work that they do. Not necessarily coming in and being the one voice that you need to listen to, whether you agree with it or not. We agree with this. Does anybody struggle with this in their own orgs today? Awesome. So, using AI solutions that help employees operate with less direct oversight from management, obviously autonomy is going to lead to greater job satisfaction in that way. So, at a pharmacy I worked with, for example, they were essentially having pharmacists use AI tools to predict when pharmacy orders would be ready. So the goal was improve customer satisfaction among those waiting for unfulfilled orders. So using the tool ultimately has reduced customer complaints about wait times, leading to fewer interventions from management. And that's something that employees notice in their day-to-day work. They're not getting those daily calls to talk about customer complaints, when in reality, a manager actually called the pharmacy to let them know that they were doing such a fantastic job around reducing customer complaints. And that's ultimately what brings people joy in their work. So it's thinking through what is the end goal of this use case? How are we going to have people focus on less about the customer complaints, but more about predicting the service that we're going to need? And then how are we rewarding employees when they're actually using AI to support better customer satisfaction at the end of the day too? I was talking to you about this before this. And we'll get more into this in the talk too. It's more about starting with the use case and thinking through ultimately what that drives as value for the organization, as opposed to starting with a solution and then looking for that solution where it fits. So we talked about deriving value through greater autonomy. I also want to talk about deriving value from AI through stronger relationships. So bringing AI into operations is often a networking issue. In that way, what I find is ultimately data scientists in large organizations really feel like they're on an island. So those highly advanced technical individuals who are out there working on these use cases at large enterprises, although they're in a team of maybe 50,000 people at their company, they feel like they're alone on their island because they don't have a relationship built with end users. They don't have a relationship built with other technical individuals in their role at their level in their board. Same thing at the analyst level. They aren't sure who to go to in terms of thinking about potential AI use cases in their own business flow and how AI flows into that as well. So although these are extremely wide-ranging, large organizations, individuals still feel like they're missing those strong relationships that they need in their board to ultimately drive value too. Has anybody heard of self-determination theory in here? Yeah, a little bit. So people have a psychological need to interact with, connect with, and care for others. So when thinking about AI use cases, people will not find value in technologies that make them feel isolated or solitary in that way. So we need to think about how whatever we're implementing, whether it's AI or another technology that comes to be, we are not driving even more isolation, especially in this post-COVID world in that way. So thinking about how we can drive greater relationships at a few different levels. So in our research too, we found a couple interesting data points. In one way, AI has improved interactions with team members. So 56% of people in our research and the teams that we worked with found that interactions with their team members have been improved. 47% found interactions with their managers have improved. And 52% found that interactions with people in other departments has also improved as well. And I think this is a very interesting standpoint, especially looking at interactions with team members and interactions with people in other departments in data points here, because a lot of times, although we are organized by function, and I'm not arguing that we should change how we organize our organizations, but with the use cases that are coming to be, AI is inherently cross-functional. The use cases are cross-functional, so we need to act in teams as cross-functional ways too. So a lot of teams are thinking about how AI and the use cases that are coming to be are really enabling strong collaboration between other functions that we work in order to bring AI solutions into production, out into operations in that way. So because of that, there's also a growth of org-wide awareness. Given that there are so many applications of AI in an organization, people might not be aware of how their coworkers are using similar technologies. So we have these subsets of teams focusing on particular AI use cases in their area. A lot of times what we see orgs struggling with is not coming up a level and speaking to how many teams across the geography of our organization working with AI in different ways. So that's where I've worked with a local bank to really come up and communicate and document all the ways that an organization uses AI to really help the various teams see what they have in common and see how they're using similar tools as well as similar data sets to accomplish similar questions that they have. I'm finding specifically that over the past couple of years, there's been a lot more of a cleanup effort that's been happening. So long-term, past 5 years, it's been a more is more kind of approach in terms of BI and just data use cases that are out there. Now we're coming to a funny swing of the pendulum where now there are so many reports, there's so many use cases out there related to data-driven insights. There's a bit of a cleanup that's happening where people are actually applying full-time employees to reducing the 5 reports that are supposed to say the same answer, are supposed to come to the same conclusion, and bringing it back to what is the one true source of truth that we want to point to. So I think it's interesting that the greater documentation, even though documentation appears to be a lot of bane of the existence of a lot of individuals, the more documentation related to how other teams are leveraging AI use cases, the more that we can bring it up a level and say, hey, there are concurrent use cases that are happening. Maybe we should combine our resources in that area. I also want to bring up an interesting point too around partnership awareness. With so many companies that are focused on AI that are sprouting up with the woodwork, a lot of partners are working with manager level individuals related to, hey, we can bring AI into your org, we can help you with this AI specific solution. Bringing it up a level to have an org view of really all of the different AI partnerships that have been stood up in an organization can really help to really understand how different areas are using AI and really how different partners have been brought in to help different separate areas too. So I think helping to document all the different partnerships that we have and evaluating partners in a very consistent way related to what are the value is that you are providing and how are you partnering with other teams in our org, I think is something that I've seen some procurement teams start to focus on, but I think business teams should also prioritize too. So that's a partnership awareness standpoint. I want to talk about AI adherence, so the stickiness of AI in our organization. So we started with adoption, but actually getting into AI adherence. Really promoting a virtuous cycle of use and value. So the more people use AI, obviously the more value that they're going to derive from it. And those positive results are going to lead to more AI use. So I like to summarize kind of successful attitude towards AI with, I think is quite an intriguing word, which is greedy. I find that the more teams are greedy with their AI use cases, the more successful they are. And here's what I mean by that. If you come with an individual use case and you see value from it, you should come back with 2, 3, 4, 5 more needs and use cases for AI. Essentially, as a business partner, trying to pull more and more out of AI in terms of the value that it can provide for your area. So I want to emphasize as much as possible to be greedy with AI and try and ask for an initial use case, but then ask for more and more as you continue to get value from it too. You'll see that as you get more competent and it's transforming into multiple more and more use cases, again, if you have that org-wide view of what everyone else is working on too, you can start to check off duplicative boxes around the value that you can get. I also want to talk about part of adherence is continued usage and trust. So individuals who trust AI are over 2 times as likely to use it regularly as individuals who do not trust the technology. Pretty obvious, right? But I think part of adherence and trust is being able to easily interpret AI-based outcomes and recommendations. So when users can interpret AI outcomes, they're over 3 times likely to trust the technology compared to others who cannot. And explainability and interpretability is nothing new in this space, but I think tactically what I've seen teams really start to apply around explainability is including additional context in the form of data stewardship related to AI solutions that are delivered for the business. So one, what is the front end, the user interface of your AI solution for the business? And then what kind of context does that front end actually provide to the business user around confidence level, the data sources and the data sets that are being used in this model? Ultimately what the model is saying, and then the intended use case and decision that should be made from the model's output here. So really breaking down explainability and really transparency around how the model works is obviously important, but also demonstrating value, and demonstrating value quickly really helps build trust too. So thinking through how can we trust technology to individuals who are not getting value, and really offering a bit of a performance guarantee, which I think is very interesting. So performance guarantee, for certain use cases, is interesting in that teams have really started to say, hey, business area, if you're going to use this specific AI use case, through our own due diligence, we can estimate the performance of the AI solution. We've seen the performance data, and we can basically model the performance distribution of this AI model in your area. Now, to actually provide a guarantee, going as far as making claim to the business users that we're confident that you can expect this level of performance from an AI in your area. And if the performance falls short, we can cover financial losses faced by you, the users in your area, because you've trusted it in its performance in that way. So a bit of a hot take here that I want to step back and really emphasize here. You're trying to build a relationship with business partners to actually trust and integrate this AI solution into their day-to-day work. It's a bit of a bold claim to offer a performance guarantee in that way, but think about the leaps and bounds that it makes in terms of building trust between you, the technical team, and the actual business team that's intended to use it, and really integrate it into their day-to-day work. Level of trust that needs to be put into this performance guarantee, and you sticking your neck out there as a technical team saying, listen, we will cover the losses, whatever that looks like, from a financial standpoint, from a time standpoint. We are building in an internal guarantee as a bit of a service provider inside of our organization if this falls short. I think that simply creates a different level of trust and engagement. And we can even break it down, maybe it's not at the AI use case level, but more at the data set level. So looking at the data sets that feed certain models and really enabling more self-service data enablement in your organization, a lot of teams are starting to stamp more and more data sets as that bronze, silver, and gold level of something that you can trust. It's been essentially vetted by other humans in my organization, that it has been cleaned and it's been trustworthy and it's been checked so that you can go and use it and ensure that it's the right data set for your space too. So think about building in performance guarantees either at the model level or at the data set level in terms of what's supporting the business, and work on communicating it, whether it's in a bronze, silver, gold, or a performance guarantee to the business to ensure that they can build that trust. Now, of course, initial hesitancy in adopting AI is common, particularly for those who've never used it before. And of course, it's a change in your work, and it's something that whenever you're being asked to change something, you're gonna have some hesitancy. So a proper solution to the change and really the resistance to change is to get people to trust AI, but I think there's more than trust that is just driving the factor of adoption here, which is a lot of teams, more and more, specifically one in the manufacturing space that I've worked with, is starting to require the use of AI. So hot take number 2 today, which is actually going out and requiring the use of AI while making it easy to use, especially in the early stages of adoption, can be just as important to fostering trust when it comes to getting employees to use AI. So this can be a complementary but not oppositional approach. And here's what I mean by that. Requiring the use of and building trust in technology are complementary and not oppositional approaches. So we're requiring to use, while requiring AI can jumpstart adoption, there's still an importance to include agency in terms of personal employee agency to protect their individual choice and override the AI if it comes down to it as well. So you can require it, yes, but I would also encourage to build in an override ability so people can actually take an input from an AI, but then ultimately override the decision and make their own decision from that. We find that when the person has agency and the ability to override the output of an AI, they are 2.1 times more likely to ultimately trust and then use an AI solution than if they didn't have it at all. Their hands were clean and they weren't able to actually impact the output of the AI model. Something that I also want to emphasize here is leading by example, especially at the manager level. We find that managers who lead by example, by using AI with their teams, are making that so their teams are over 3 times more likely to use AI themselves. Pretty straightforward in that way too, but I think you as a manager showing individual value for yourself really encourages your teams to take it and use it in their own space, and really bring questions back to you because they see you as a manager are using yourself too. So I want to emphasize, of course, building an agency for folks to override it, but also leading by example in terms of showing how you have found value from AI in your space too. Ultimately, improving awareness and perception of AI is especially critical in the early stages of AI adoption. So people who use AI and see AI as an opportunity for their job are in a similar vein over 3 times as likely to use it themselves. The biggest perception right now is that AI will take my job. So I think the more that you as a manager can show using it, even setting up required uses and building an agency for folks to override AI too, we find that it influences the organization's ability to really scale AI use cases at their own space, because if individuals are using it, there's ultimately more successes to be able to showcase at the individual level. And when peers are seeing their other employees using AI in their space too, they're also more motivated to try it out themselves. So that's AI adherence. And now for one more topic, I'd like to get into organizational AI value. So really breaking down how to align the individual value and the organizational value. So the likelihood that an organization obtains really significant benefits from AI really triples when AI becomes a core element of the business strategy across nearly all of the business functions. So individuals can get AI value from AI without the company benefiting, and vice versa. And I want to say that again. So individuals can get value from AI without the organization benefiting from AI, as well as the organization can get value from AI without the individuals benefiting from AI. And what I want to do in this section is break down that relationship between individual value and organizational value. Because ultimately, it's hard to get multiple people on the same page in terms of adopting a particular solution if one, it's not addressing the immediate needs that they have in their business area. But then two, they are putting in more time and they're not putting in more effort than the benefit they are seeing in their own respective area too. So that's what I want to break down, avoiding the lure of low value, shiny AI. One of my favorite quotes I heard from a team member I worked with is, AI might be easy for people to adopt, but individuals sometimes chase the latest AI fad without considering the actual value. So this brings some ideas to mind around generative AI and the fad that we're all hearing today. I cannot emphasize enough the amount of teams that have just come to me personally about wanting to get into AI for the very first time and going right into how can we do generative AI, how can we do deep learning in our own space too. So there's a huge hype around this that I really want to speak to, but really outside of the solution, the hype around a particular solution, it all comes back to focusing on customer value and customer experience. So thinking about not focusing on shiny things like AI and in the AI space, but really focusing on what is the customer value and what is the customer experience that we're driving from whatever solution we want to bring into the fold. So a lot of teams are so eager to bring in this shiny, cool new solution. I think they fall short in terms of not stepping back and thinking about what is the actual value to the customer that we're providing here with this AI solution. How can we start with a particular use case and then work backwards to figure out what type of AI solution, what type of implementation would actually drive that value, as opposed to just leading in with the solution to start. I also want to caution against avoiding burdening people to serve the machines in this way. So this is where I'm talking about organizations can get value from AI while some individuals in the organization do not. So for instance, if we're spending time entering data or teaching misguided AI systems to create value for an organization, there's still an expense of employee hours and employee time that's spent to actually do the training and do the misuse adjustment as well too. So it's important to think through when we're doing this implementation, if there's a data cleaning aspect or if there is additional training that we need to do amongst individuals in our team, how do we make sure we're not burdening the people just to move an AI use case forward in that way? Thinking about what are their short-term efforts that they're going to need to address this, and then ultimately, what's the long-term effort that's going to come back to them, and how do we help them connect the dots in that way? A lot of times, when people hear AI, when people hear change, when people hear, I need to do something different in my space to help implement this org-wide initiative, that equals more work for me. And historically, orgs are very notorious for kind of leaning on employees to absorb these additional activities for the sake of innovation. So At a university hospital's ICU unit that I worked with, one of their use cases particularly fell short for this reason. So they were expecting busy clinicians, nurses, doctors on the floor who essentially put in extra work to input data into the system outside of their regular workflow, which is a classic case of illustrating really how a focus on creating organizational value can really misguide you in terms of the visual autonomy that the workers may miss out on when you're asking them to put in data and they don't really see the direct value tied to it as well. So going back to what is the individual value that a person is getting from this solution, and then what's the amount of effort or loss that they're putting into making this solution come to life, and will it ultimately come back to serve them in the future or not? So breaking that down and making sure that the benefits offset efforts at an individual level. So even if AI solutions create value for some people, the individuals who reap the value might not be the same ones who bear most of the effort that they're putting into it too. So thinking through who are we actually serving with this particular AI use case, but then what is the wider system of people that we will need to lean on to actually make this use case come to life? And if there's a certain level of effort that's needed, is that something that we should continue to do internally and really put on people's plates? Or are there additional partners that we can bring in and really balance that build versus buy split around how we're actually bringing this model into production too? Yeah,
So
question?
what was the solution for the nurses when they didn't want to put data in?
Yeah, so the solution was, let's get additional college students and interns to follow around the nurses and enter in that info.
Wow.
During the
Did they do that?
Yeah, they actually did that, yeah. So all going back to, if we're getting really tangible about it, like breaking down what is the hourly rate of these individuals that we're expecting to do this work? And then ultimately, how much time is spent on what we're needing them to do specific to the use case, and how can we bring it back to cost-benefit analysis? Is it worth a doctor's time to be entering in data, or should we be paying them for this much more high-value diagnosis for a patient in that way? And then how can we pull on resources that may be cheaper to us, interns, students in the area, or automations that can live on top of the workflows as well, to maybe not precisely capture the information maybe as well as a doctor might have, maybe get 80% there as a plug-in solution just to get started and get it off the ground too. That's a good question. Any other questions? I'm going pretty quick. I just want to set back and see if you guys have any questions before I proceed. Okay, awesome. So, talking about benefits offsetting efforts at an individual level, really breaking down who is the use case for, ultimately how much time are they going to need to put in to support getting this whole use case off the ground, and then ultimately what is the time savings or whatever benefit that's going to come back in their space, and how can we do a cost benefit analysis even before getting started on the use case and asking people to join in to support. And I really want to emphasize here, demonstrating value at a local level is so key. A lot of, I think, teams and individuals feel like this AI thing is this wide-reaching kind of whale of a thing that we're trying to implement in our organization. But they're struggling to see what is the local immediate value for me at my space, whether it's my own team, my own function, my own geography. Like, where is that aha moment where it's like, wow, this is going to help me solve a problem that I'm facing in operations tomorrow with this AI use case in that way. So really emphasizing, even if it's not a huge hallmark win in terms of a benefit, but still showing some sort of change in a person's day-to-day work should not be understated, in that even if it's not a huge tangible value monetarily, there's a change, there's an aha moment that a human in your organization had related to seeing a value and a change in their work and ultimately adopting it because they saw that. And how can we highlight that and show that quick win to other folks in the org to really help kind of reduce that hurdle that may be felt around, oh, I'm going to participate in AI now, I'm going to have to use it now in this way. And it's going to be taking extra time, and there's intangible value I may see. Bringing it back to the tangible value tomorrow, this week, as much as possible, I think is so very important. And that's really one of my personal missions, is to kind of humanize AI in that way. So really think about how to give it a face, how to make it something as a bit of a co-pilot that people can ultimately lean on and make their own work better in their day-to-day space too. Which can be particularly challenging when you think about AI and data science as a topic overall that folks really don't feel is approachable as something that they can work with. So expanding on that, really having that system of creating business value and individual level, at the individual level, and really pointing to individual use cases that boil up to ultimately team-wide use cases, department-wide use cases, and org-wide use cases. So as an example, bringing it back to the claims, if we can focus on just one person in a call center that's seeing value, having them internally be that champion for their other peers to say, hey, I tried this thing, It's not perfect, it's early on, it's not going to be perfect, but it's helped me save this amount of time, it's helped me have this additional confidence in my own work, it's helped me have additional trust that what I'm doing is the right decision. That can speak volumes to how others may see value in it too, because they can see themselves in their peer and they'll ultimately adopt it too. So rather than feeling threatened by AI, the more we can emphasize workers, employees, seeing AI as a coworker, as something that can support you and have you focus on more high value, smart decision making, as opposed to full replacement of transactional work, I think that also speaks volumes. Visible AI heavy applications that I spoke to are not the only way people use AI. I think at this point, just about all of us at the consumer level use AI in some way or another. So it's so widespread that everybody uses it to some degree. And now this is a quote from 2017. People using AI are starting to replace people who don't use AI. And that trend will only accelerate. I would say that this trend has shifted a bit since this quote in 2017, and that AI's threat to people's job isn't about whether someone is just using AI, but rather the new threat is that if people are not using AI to become more self-determined, to become more autonomous, to become more able to level themselves up in the work that they do, that they and their company will miss out on important sources of individual and corporate value. So it's not just about using it anymore. It's really getting into how are you using it for an actual value, and how are you using it to become more autonomous in your space while feeling plugged into other individuals in your work who are using it too. So all to say, to bring it back to the relationship between individual and organizational value from AI is additive, it's not zero sum. And one last example of this that I really want to point to in terms of showing value related to AI is that a head of ML Ops at a large automotive manufacturer has essentially built out a whole command center. And command center sounds fancy, but it's really just dashboards that they've created themselves in their own space related to pointing to specific usage that each of their AI use cases that they've deployed, who are the actual users in our operations today who are using it. So now, whenever a leader comes to the MLOps team is talking about what's the value that you provided for the organization, he's literally able to point to, instead of me speaking to the head of MLOps, the value that the business is getting, I can point to the specific users who are using each of these models. I encourage you to go and talk to them and really understand in their day-to-day work how they've integrated it and how it's driven a high-impact decision that they're making today. So instead of us as kind of the technical core taking on the justification, the proving of value constantly, the more you can point to individual value and individual usage at a very high level, even if it's they opened the model and queried it once yesterday. The more you can point out across the geography of the large organization, here's who is using it, and if you're getting fancy, even here's how they've used it, the more you can really emphasize the individual level and how it's rolling up to the organizational level of value too. So with that was a quick breeze through my topics related to adoption, adherence, and organizational value. I'm gonna step back, see if you guys have any questions, anything that I discussed today. Happy to dive into anything in more detail. Yeah.
So I think a lot of what I was hearing was slotting AI into existing processes and then sort of doing the value off of that. But I think a lot of the sort of, and there's probably a lot of inefficiencies and waste and things that can be improved with that. But to the extent that the AI demands a change in the overall process themselves, that seems a harder thing to value, especially since it's like you have to go in on this investment to shift your processes.
Yeah.
Like this is where like new startups come in to do something different than you, and that's you lose business. So, is there sort of like that line of when does the consideration of just improving the existing process shift over to broader implementations? And like I feel like that's all the things that you were discussing are harder to manage when you're doing those like true system change.
Yeah, like at a small team level to start,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, so that's where I've seen, if you have the resources to afford it, setting up a bit of a control team and an experimental team to basically test out that overall process change in a bit of a vacuum before you do it at wide scale across multiple teams. That way you can do a bit of an A/B testing around, okay, we are changing the system that this team goes into, the process that they're following, and ultimately the data that we're able to collect and really retrain the ML model on in that space in the future too. For example, one of my customers is working on essentially looking at how can we leverage Gen AI to predict and draft statements of work. So anytime they have a new customer come in, they're a medical supplies devices company. Anytime we have a new customer come in, there's a statement of work that we're spending hours on drafting with each and every new customer and each and every new engagement. How can we start to one, use generative AI to save our time drafting those documents in a simple manner. But then two, without going and addressing every single SOW at the same time and potentially creating this catastrophe, how can we start with one aspect of the SOW? Let's start with one of the most predictable, consistent fields within that SOW as a start. And then even within that field, let's take a sub-team, maybe not everybody that drafts SOWs, but 10% of the team in that one section, just focus on that being the first change to start. So again, boiling it down to the minimal amount of business process that needs change and the minimal amount of documentation or thing that we're changing to as small of a pilot as possible, just so we can test that and build trust there. Then we can grab another field in the SOW. Then we can expand to maybe not the full SOW, but maybe more teams addressing 50% of the overall statement of work document too. So all to say, I think when you're faced with these large system-wide changes that you're thinking about essentially scaling someday, because that's where the true value comes in, I think the more you can start small, but also the more you can lean on, especially with all of the new AI companies coming out, as a partner to basically go and test this in a vacuum even outside of your organization and prove it out as a bit of a pilot before you integrate it to be a step to get there too. And that answer your question?
Yeah, it's that naughty, it's one of those sort of fundamental, like if you're just constantly changing small processes.
Yeah.
And like if you're just slotting in and making your process more efficient, where like losing like how to balance that focus. So it's a naughty question. It's like I wasn't expecting that. It's sort of this thought thing that comes up a lot.
Yeah, it's classic change management. It's thinking through with any new innovation that's going to be like, how are we actually going to change our business while keep it running at the same time? Like, and it all comes back to, again, if there's initial champions that are also very supportive or very creative in being part of the innovation space, I think that helps too, because if you're facing an uphill battle of people who are resistant to it, people who don't even want to get into it, and then you're expecting them to not only change, but then also report back and talk about the success and how it's going to, it's a lot to ask of an individual who's already swamped too. So setting with those individual champions helps.
I guess on the statement of work line,
Yeah.
the number of people at the firm that were tasked with writing statements of work.
So
Like, and were they inefficiently allocated? Like, was there something else they should have been doing with their time instead of statements of work? Or like, did they have a set of employees that were hired because we need, 5 guys that always write statements?
for them, it was a bit easier because it wasn't their only part of their job. So writing statements of work was kind of like the burden, the thing that nobody liked doing at that organization. So that was a pretty easy sell in terms of, hey, none of us like doing this typing. We'd rather go out and actually be talking to the customers and like getting the engagement set up. So this is something that inherently a large population of the people who were doing the drafting the statements of work wanted to happen. So when they were looking for hands in terms of the 50 people who are doing this activity, we need 10 to do this pilot and start with like a small subset of that SOW. It's relatively easy to get folks bought in and get that pilot. Yeah, question.
Have you seen any good numbers or measurement approaches for AI? In terms of, hey, this project returned X value, or, because ROI, we can get caught in ROI sometimes.
Yeah.
It can be misleading, can be long payback periods, but just where you seeing like companies or use cases that, those are meaningful return?
And I've seen companies break it down kind of in two ways. So I think there's a straightforward ROI calculation that a lot of teams are doing related to time savings. So we're able to make either a time savings in terms of time to serve a customer, or maybe it's greater confidence in terms of customer churn, which is a very, very difficult one to try and predict when you're looking at that. But when we're breaking it down, if it's a simple kind of like manufacturing use case or process use case related to the amount of time we're spending trying to, one, do the analysis, then actually take action on it. Like that's more of a, what was our total time in terms of resources, hires, technology onboarding, investment to actually get this model out there? And then what is the time savings that it's achieving to? So at a specific level, it's really breaking down the business process side of like, this person is this many hours or dollars per hour, and they're spending this many hours doing this activity. Ideal state, if we implement an AI solution, maybe it'll address half of that time. But that is kind of the clean, simple version to start. What I'm seeing more and more teams do in playing that long game around the value that the AI providing is look at also their own production, their own takt time to actually get a model deployed into production and retrain and redeploy the model into production as well. So if it took 90 days before for the team from beginning to end to deploy the very first model in production, what ratchets are we doing to make it closer and closer to 30 days? 1 week in terms of getting a model in production as well, because the technical team are also very expensive resources. So how are we essentially reducing data scientists and data engineer time in terms of how long it takes to actually get a model out into production? So that's something that, just to speak to an example here, large automotive manufacturer in Ohio really focusing on supply chain as putting out a model that essentially helps us predict supply chain shortages that are going to impact the manufacturing line at the end of the day. At a high level, 40% of all parts in the entire supply chain are late by at least a week, which was kind of like the headline figure that really got a lot of folks involved early on in the project. So they focus, of course, on what is the direct line stoppages that we're reducing. What is our baseline that we've collected even before getting this project off the ground to say, historically, we have 2 days a week of line stoppages in total related to supply chain parts being short for delivery. So have we set up the data collection around how we've categorized line shortages and what supply chain aspect is it coming from? What's that baseline? And then long term, once this model is out in deployment, what is our control period that we're setting up for us as a team? Are we expecting to reduce shortages within 90 days, within 180 days? Like, we need to set that expectation with the team too around, just because we put the model out on Monday doesn't mean we're going to see line shortages be eliminated by Tuesday. So setting up that early on conversation around what is our baseline for them with line stoppages, and then within what time period do we start to see some sort of impact? Of course, not full causation here, some correlation with other environmental impacts, but when are we going to start to see some sort of tick down where if it's not by day 180, then something's not right, the model isn't supporting what it's needing to do. And that leads you to go down to more of the business process level of how people are actually using it, are they actually adopting it. So there's that side of like the actual metric for the business getting reduced. Then there's also iterations to the model, redeployments that we're going to need to do. If it took us 180 days to get it out there, how can we reduce that for the future models that we have coming up too? Because we have a pile of 50 other use cases that we'd like to address as well. So how are we reducing the investment, the kind of denominator in this equation of cost versus benefit, and really breaking down how is the team spending their time more wisely to get more models out there too? It's kind of two levels, the business benefit, but then the core technical team investment that they're spending too.
Thanks.
Yeah. Good question. Other questions? Yeah.
So I think you've talked about this a little bit, but I'm interested specifically in the idea that in a lot of cases, at least in my experience, a part and even most of the benefit from AI or analytics can be not so much the direct benefit to the company at the time, but the consequences of staying where you are. So,
Right.
for example, if our competitors get better at picking the best customers, we're going to get stuck with the worst customers, right? And so, do you have any thoughts about ways to establish that kind of trust from your stakeholders that these kind of intangible benefits are really real and that this is a potential event that can happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something that fascinated me. I basically attended, it was like a meeting of chief information security officers really learning about the base foundations of AI, and that's obviously top of mind for them is what are the risks or vulnerabilities that are introduced when we're implementing or having folks in the business implement new AI use cases. One thing that really surprised me though is that across the room, every leader was willing to take on the risk that came with AI because they perceived the risk of losing customers due to not having AI as being much greater than any new vulnerabilities that could get introduced in their organization today. Which really surprised me coming from CISOs and like governance leaders especially because like their whole job is to make sure like we are making the data secure and we are really not setting up any new vulnerabilities. So that really surprised me. But back to your question in terms of like what is the risk of us not doing it and how do we quantify that? I think it starts even with, well there's a few levels to it and all very tough to measure. But as general categories, one, how are we attracting even better people to even come through our doors to build better models and support better use cases? Whether we are or are not using AI. And that's where you're seeing a lot of organizations just say they're using AI now as a bit of a marketing tactic just to get more customers and get more people actually signed up to join their organization too. So how are we actually tracking from the HR side when actual applicants to jobs are bringing up interest in AI or interest in data as part of whatever job, even if it's from a technical side or if it's from a general business group too, like what is the opportunity costs that we have that we lose if we don't approach AI use cases and ultimately attract the right people who are focused on AI use cases in that space too. So that's the people side of things. There's also, I think, the overall speed of innovation and transformation that a lot of, especially large historical organizations struggle with, which is how are we doing worse at a specific business level? I think it's hard to say as an organization overall, are we more competitive or not, but like in a specific insurance company, our personal lines pricing, how are we really not keeping up with competitors like more tech native zebras of insurance out there in terms of like pricing flexibility and pricing kind of race to the bottom from a personal lines and a commercial lines standpoint. So I'd really bring it back to like core books of business, and then is there service levels that we need to compete against us versus tech native companies at a customer service standpoint, at a pricing standpoint, and I think highlighting those as opposed to like we as a company are doomed overall if we don't do this thing really keeps it so far away and intangible. And that's where I think bringing it down even from the C-suite level into director levels in each of the business areas around like what are you struggling to keep up with because of the amount of analytics time that you're putting in or the fact that you don't even have data or you don't even have the prediction model to support a pricing decision that you're about to make on a new product that we're rolling out. I think getting tangible there, so it's less of like a 5-year roadmap but more of like a quarterly, this decision we're trying to impact this quarter with whatever solution that may be from an AI standpoint. Like getting down to that level I think really helps make it much more tangible as opposed to doom and gloom, we're not going to keep up as a company if we don't do it. Thanks. Yeah.
You were talking about how we couldn't get the nurses to enter the data, right? So
Yeah.
I was just wondering, like, how long does it take for us to understand the value we are getting out of the data of AI, and maybe also to make the users, the actual users, to realize that impact?
Right. So back to his question, pointing to, is there a specific decision that we're trying to make, or is there a specific metric from a customer service standpoint? So are we trying to reduce ICU admissions from 20 minutes down to 15 minutes in that way? Is that our North Star goal? And obviously starting with, when you're asking nurses to collect data to support that use case, starting with what we're trying to do ultimately. Like, hey, person in this space, we're ultimately trying to reduce customer service time, or we're ultimately trying to, this is one of the squishier ones that I don't like, but like make your job easier, because that one's so hard to quantify. So like getting down to, instead of the squishy, we're trying to make your job better, we're trying to elevate the work that you do, really focusing in on, we're trying to go from this metric to this metric. Within the next 6 months, we think that this AI solution in terms of being able to predict customer wait time based on past trends is gonna help us get there. But like, we're still in the data collection mode and we need your help basically build that baseline of data to understand what our metrics to start looks like and then what we're going to impact it to in the end of the day. So I think people get reluctant when you're just saying, hey, we're doing this shiny AI thing and I need your help to collect data because what's this gonna do in my work? How is this gonna change what I do? But if you lead with, we're trying to do this thing for the customer, reduce their wait time to get into the ICU. We need this specific field of data and your help collecting it, so then we have a solid base of 6 months of data to confirm or deny whether the solution worked or not. Puts them more in the co-development position of, I'm helping to support whatever the best solution is at the end of the day. Either way, the goal is to reduce this customer wait time, as opposed to I'm being asked to support their researchy, AI solution. I don't know what it's going to mean, but it seems like they're really set on this pace of just getting more data, and I don't really see the value of it in that way too. So I try and lead with like solution last as much as possible, instead of like geeking out about the specific model we're going to try and implement, or like the specific tech that we're going to go and buy to make this happen. What is the specific customer impact? And once we get that baseline of data through your support as a nurse, we're going to evaluate what's the best solution for it.
So is there a way where we can understand how long should we give before we start realizing the value of this? Is there like a method to do that, or is it just going by like, okay, 6 months?
Classic statistical modeling question in terms of what's the frequency of this event that happens and how many data points do we have in terms of our overall sample that we're comparing against from a baseline standpoint. So it's hard to say really one value because each business process is so variable in terms of how many times it happens throughout the day. Is it each minute? If so, we can shorten the time period to check against if this is a minute-by-minute admission into the ICU. But from a real estate standpoint, if we're talking about home sales, which are maybe a longer term every month or so, we're gonna need a longer period of control phase. So it all goes back to your baseline that you've collected. In ideal state, we have tons of data, multi-years of data that we've collected, and then we can point to, okay, we should know some sort of cycle or trend change by the end of 2 shifts for admissions to the ICU in that way. It's all gotta be informed by historical perspective though. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
ICU's case study, was there a paper that you guys wrote on it, or is there more information available, or is it just a story that you have?
No, it's a case study that I can share with you,
Yeah.
actually. So we did it with University Hospital in the Columbus area, so yeah, I can share that with you.
Okay, I'll talk to you afterwards.
For sure. Yeah. Good question. Other questions? Yeah.
Let's go back to, letting your users override the AI. What do you see as a normal percentage of that happening as you're rolling that out? And if it goes kind of above that norm, how do you determine whether that's just your model's wrong or the user's model?
Yeah, that's a really good question because that goes into the behavioral science side of things. And it's a bit of a curve. It's not like it goes, at least in the projects that I've seen, where they're rolling it out and they've included that feature of like, hey, here's our recommendation for what we think is going to happen based on your sales activities for customer churn, for example. You have the opportunity to take that, of course, then ultimately go and make your own decision. And your manager supports you in making that own decision. Early on, it's much higher. So early on, usually it starts with 80%-ish as like the estimate around the people 80% are overriding with that AI decision. Natural curve of early adopters versus like the general population who just doesn't trust it and hasn't worked with it. Over time though, usually within a couple weeks, and this is all dependent too on making sure there are conversations amongst team members around those 20% who did not override it. Why did they not, and what was the value that they got from it too? Like there has to be kind of that threshold in terms of like what they're communicating to the 80% who haven't, and then you'll start to see it step down over time too. It's never 100% one way or the other though. It starts with initial reluctance to go and do it, but then it starts to level out at these days, at least in the project I've seen, about 50-50 in terms of like, okay, at least it's not the majority, but it's about half who are taking it and running with it, the other half who are still trusting their gut more than. And back to your prior question around how much does this inform the actual model performance? I would go back to those 50% who still did not go with what the model said. What is that reasoning? Is there specific training data that we're missing from that 50% that really informs us that we didn't address all of the specific use cases that came through? I would make it a conversation though of even letting that 50% know, hey, we're trying to drive greater adoption of these outputs and aligning the prediction with what you're doing in reality. Our goal is to get as close to 100% in terms of prediction and you going to reality as possible. We're considering retraining the model. But we want to step back and understand what else are factors that are playing into ultimately your decision that's happening. And that's where we see teams even going down and sitting with the person at the desk while they're getting faced with that decision and then having them speak out loud to make it as convenient as possible around like, I am not going with that prediction and here's why. So then they can get that rich kind of like side-by-side human-to-human data as opposed to shipping it to them and then just being confused in the technical team about why it's not getting adopted and then guessing and checking. Thank you. Good question. Yeah.
As AI is being adopted by more and more organizations, it kind of loses the competitive advantage.
Yeah.
You know what you can still do regarding AI to, have better AI models, I guess, than somebody else.
So what's the question?
To keep the competitive advantage, have better AI than somebody else, how you can.
That's interesting you frame it that way because I think about it less as better AI, but more wide-scale AI. So I think about it as instead of trying to make the most feature-rich or the best model, which is typically the priority in research, I think the priority in organizations in production is to ultimately drive just greater usage across the organization. Right now, such a small subset of organizations today are actually have wide-scale and such a small subset of the employee population are actually using AI models today. So I would argue that it's not about a constant better model, better model, better model. It's more about taking the model, making sure it's really bulletproof and testing it as much as possible, and then continually scaling so more people are leveraging it into their day-to-day work. I think the production, the operationalization is the biggest issue today that is hurting competitive advantage. It's not having the best model, because especially in the past year, there's so many more foundational models that are available for you to build off of. So you don't have to build from scratch as a traditional enterprise, but it's more about, okay, you got it in-house. How are you getting more and more people to actually use it in their workflow day in and day out and giving you that feedback based on your real reality of your organization and how it's being used that way too. Kind of back to his question, how are we getting that feedback from the user and ultimately having more people in operations just naturally using it as a co-pilot as opposed to these pilot projects for the best possible model design. That's just how I think about it though. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, question?
So when you think about it from the typical business operation standpoint, it makes sense, right? But when you think about it from an academia standpoint, there's a fear there, right? Because those skill sets that we're supposed to be developing, even at the professor level versus the student level, we're still challenging ourselves of at what point do we, kind of push the envelope on critical thinking skills, right? So what are your concerns there? Because I think that's where we're still struggling a little bit in being able to figure out where AI really plays in the academic setting.
And I think a lot of that, I think of it as really like a UI challenge, a UX challenge in that way. I think the most beautiful part of ChatGPT coming about and all the hype related to it is it's been less about, well, yes, the model's huge and what they've created, but like the UI of the model is so simple and so straightforward for people to actually approach it and start using it now. It's literally a chat box. It's something that you feel like you can go and integrate with and like talk to in a natural way. So I would think about from an operational standpoint, really what is that user interface that folks in the business are actually like going to set up kind of like a query based on our own production data and our own operations. I would think through, in terms of thinking about how we're impacting critical thinking, the big kind of focus right now is prompt engineering in that way. How can we type in the better thing to get the model to do exactly what we want? I would argue that instead of just pushing as much information as possible to the individual, it's more about having the individual prioritize what specifically they have the AI help with versus what they themselves do in their own work. So I think it's more of a critical thinking approach is less about is AI good or bad, should I use AI or not? It's more about when, how, what is the AI that's available to me doing that supports me doing this other work? And how can it be right there with me along the way as I'm providing more value to the organization? So I would argue that the critical thinking challenge now, it's a classic one, but it's the employee thinking about how are they adding the most value to the organization? How are they in their role providing the most strategic business benefit? And how is AI just there to support them and reduce the amount of like tedious work that they were potentially doing? And the UX plays into that, kind of back to my prior point in that, are we giving them a chat box to engage with? What is the kind of like form, what is the thing that they go to that they ultimately put in a question or speak to, like what is the audio, visual, text way that they are feeding the information into the model, and then ultimately how is that model providing information back? And kind of tweaking that delivery method of the information to inform the better critical thinking related to not distracting them from the work that they're doing, but really giving them, okay, got it, got what I needed, I can go talk to the customer about this specific thing. Question? Any other questions? We have a minute or two left.
Any other questions? Before we conclude this session, everybody should have a piece of paper in front of you, which is a survey for this session. We would love to hear from you about, whether the topic interests you, what type of, what aspect can we improve. So we would love to, hear from your feedbacks, and our student will collect the feedback form after we, conclude the session. All right. Any other questions for the speakers? No? All right, let's thank our speaker, Nick Wu.